Good evening. My name is Gay Allison, and I manage the National Science Foundation EPSCoR grant here on the University of Montana campus. And if any of you are like me, EPSCoR is an acronym that sort of moves through your day like all other acronyms do, and nobody really understands them, but we all use them. And this one, in this particular case, stands for Experimental Program to Stimulate Competitive Research. And this is federally mandated money that comes through Congress to all the federal agencies, who then allow states that are underfunded in the sciences to compete for grant money. One of the other things we can do is outreach to the community in lots of different ways, and we do that here, in this case, with our Science Within Society lecture series. And it's a place where we felt it was important to bring science and the arts together in a balance, in a community discussion in some form or another, and inviting speakers in, and this is our 4th year doing that, is one way to have a dialogue with the community and people on campus or off, talking about things that are developing here in our state and of interest to you all. And so tonight, since I can't introduce our program coordinator because she's off making copies, who is Deb Fosnot, she replaced Holly Truitt, who has worked with us for 3 years. I get to introduce our guest lecturer, and this is Dr. Denny Elliott, who is here. And I apologize that I have to read this because I wasn't as prepared as Deb was, but Denny Elliott holds Poynter Jameson Chair of Media Ethics and Press Policy at the University of South Florida. This is a woman who is very, very busy. Once you listen to all of this, she's done a lot and continues to do a great deal. She also, in her consulting life, she's the ethics officer for the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. So you can see she's bouncing back and forth. And previously, Denny spent 12 years here at the University of Montana, where she served as a professor in philosophy, where I first met her 10 years ago, probably briefly. She was an adjunct professor in journalism, or currently, or was then?
Yeah, I was here.
Okay, when she was here. Yeah. In journalism, and she's also the founding director of the Practical Ethics Center. Denny has written extensively for scholarly trade and lay audiences on a variety of topics in practical ethics. Her work on research ethics has led to grants for the development of teaching and assessment tools from the National Science Foundation and other the Federal Office of Research Integrity and the U.S. Department of Education. She also co-hosts weekly nationally syndicated radio show for public radio called Ethically Speaking. So could you please join me in welcoming Dr. Elliott?
Hi. We're all better at other things. Okay. Yeah, as Kate mentioned, I have this bi-coastal academic life where we travel between South Florida and Southern California, but maintain my home here in Montana. My problem was that when I was getting ready to come to Montana this summer, I thought I was coming to Montana in the summer, and so I packed things like shorts and sandals. And so actually, soon after I got into town, I remembered that one of my colleagues in Florida said that she wondered whether I ever missed, like not having a chance to wear like wool sweaters and socks and all those warm sort of fuzzy things. And I said then what I should have remembered, which is I'm going to Montana for the summer. We certainly get a lot of good weather here. It's only snowed once since I've been home. I just moved to Florida after 12 years here. And my experience is that when I change jobs, homes, lives, I find that I learn more about myself. I always grow intellectually, and with any luck, I have an opportunity to grow ethically as well. One of my duties at the University of South Florida is to put together a yearly conference of national academic importance in this broad area that I've been working for 25 years or so called practical ethics. So as I began working on my first conference, which will happen in St. Petersburg next January, I'm not having any trouble getting people to agree to come down for that, by the way, I realized that I had recognized a new ethical imperative, and that's that I will never again, after all of my years of doing these conferences, I will never again put on an academic conference unless it has direct and measurable impact on the local community. And when I talk about providing direct and measurable impact on the local community, I mean something more than that my conference participants will stay at the hotels and eat at the restaurants. I'm not going to go specifically into the conference and how I'm actually planning to pull that off year after year, but when we get into the discussion period, if anyone wants to talk about that, we certainly can. What was important, I think, is my realization, and that's what relates to the talk for tonight. What I realized is that colleges and universities have responsibilities to the communities in which they find themselves, if for no other reason than the forced relationship in which communities and institutions find themselves. It's kind of like the person who's lived around nature for a long time and then, goes for a walk in the woods or up the mountain and suddenly says, oh my gosh, I've got responsibilities to the earth that's given me so much. It's possible excuse me. It's possible to go through life and not realize, that we have responsibilities to nature or to the world. But I don't find many people like that who live in Montana. And so my impression is that most of us, thanks, Gay, is that most of us have had that experience in Montana of realizing what we owe back to nature. And that serves as actually a pretty good analogy for what I'm trying to say about campus-community relationship, which I now think is it's almost like being in a family. It's weird to me that I've been in academia for, however many years of undergraduate, graduate school, assistant professorship, all this stuff, and finally it dawned on me that I have a responsibility to the community. Just like families, institutions of higher education and communities, those of us who live here, didn't explicitly create this situation in which we find ourselves. Nevertheless, we're here. That's what's like being in a family. Even if you can't choose your relatives, you still have a responsibility toward them anyway. So what I'm implicitly suggesting today is that here we are, finding ourselves in this relationship, whether we like it or not, between campus and community, has moral weight for those of us on campus, for sure. I'll be arguing for what I call a relational model between institutions of higher education and communities. I think that relationships impact in a variety of ways, such as procurement, where universities get their stuff, requirements for recycling, economic development, what campuses do to encourage growth within their communities, and particularly economically deprived areas, environmental restoration, and philanthropy. But tonight I'll address specifically how that relationship plays out in higher education research function. I'll be offering the relational model as a different and more ethical base for understanding the role that local community volunteers play in research than the current historical model that I call the human subjects model. The title of my talk tonight, Community as Laboratory, is kind of, I want to say it's ironic, but it's certainly ambiguous, in that I think that some researchers have looked at community as laboratory for a long time. It's been their place to test. It's been an object for their work. That's not what I mean when I talk about campus as or community as laboratory. What I mean is that when citizens and campus work together in a collaborative way, all sorts of wonderful things happen for and in the community. Gay had mentioned the SBIR, the small business collaboration with campus, and that's a wonderful example of what I'm trying to talk about tonight. Now, you have a handout, or there are handouts floating around here someplace, that have on one side cases for consideration, and on the other side just a very brief outline of some of the things that I'm covering tonight. What I'm going to do is to talk to you a little bit about the history and kind of where we find ourselves today, and then I will be actually asking you for your input in terms of your intuition around those cases. And for my REU students who are here with me tonight, I promise this is the longest you will ever hear me talk in 7 weeks of being together. I want to point out that there's a long and troubled history of the use of human beings in research. A series of formal rules and regulations began to be developed with the Nuremberg Code after World War II in response to what Nazi doctors did to prisoners and folks in the concentration camps. In 1969, something called the Declaration of Helsinki clarified what we now call informed consent. Public Health Services Act of 1985 started to say, you know, federally, if we're going to give money for research, we want to make sure that people aren't being unnecessarily harmed in the process of doing research. By 1991, something called the Common Rule had formed that provides uniform guidelines for research funded by 20 different federal agencies and departments. So basically, across the board, if you're going to work on a federally funded grant, 4 things are required. One is that a project has IRB review. IRB is the Institutional Review Board, required that every research institution have one. It means that a group of people who aren't involved in the actual research have an opportunity to take a look and say, you know, they look at a couple of things. Have the subjects, the human subjects in the research, given what we call voluntary informed consent. The IRB weighs the risks to the subjects against the benefits to society. Now that's a very funny equation that we'll talk about a little more later. They look at justice. They look to see who is included in the process of the project and who's left out. But beginning just World War II, just because it's a handy starting place, research has been done, I mean, not just in research institutions, but a number of people, including government officials, look for opportunities to test things out. And so when it was decided to drop the atomic bomb on Japan at the end of World War II, Nagasaki and Hiroshima were chosen particularly because of the research implications. That is, Hiroshima is the city that my husband, stepdaughter, and I visited a couple of years ago. It's an incredible city, surrounded completely by mountains on one side, and then the water, and actually more sort of mountains, barriers in the water as well. And one of the things that that the American government researchers were interested in is to see what happens when you drop an atomic bomb in an area that's entirely enclosed like that. All that they knew from testing before was testing that had been done in sort of big open spaces like the Nevada desert. And then after World War II, while Americans were horrified along with the rest of the world to find out what had been done to concentration camp folks during World War II, at the very same time in the United States, we are in the midst of our own series of experiments that involve charting the progress of about 400 African American men who were infected with syphilis. They weren't purposely infected with syphilis, by the way. When the Tuskegee study began in the 1930s, there was no known cure for syphilis. However, although penicillin was known to be a cure by the early 1950s, men in the study were denied treatment until 1972. In cases where other physicians sort of recognized that you know, they had a man who had this disease and wanted to treat it, the researchers tried to persuade the men not to get treatment. The study was extended based on the argument that if the study was stopped by helping the individuals who were in the study, that would interfere with the benefits to medical science of studying the untreated disease. So again, look at that risk-benefit balance. The risk to the subjects, the benefit to society. President Clinton apologized to the 8 survivors and families of other participants finally in 1997. 1961 to 1963, a Yale psychologist by the name of Stanley Milgram performed a series of experiments to test the subject's obedience to authority. These individuals who were paid $4.50 for their 1 hour of participation, I mean, that was pretty good rates, you know, for the time. They were met by an experimenter who had a white coat, holding a clipboard, looking very formal, and a co-subject who was, you know, looking like an ordinary guy. That co-subject actually was part of the research team. So what happened is the volunteer was told that this is an experiment about the effects of punishment on learning. And then the volunteer watched while the co-subject is strapped down to a chair, electrodes put on his arm, The volunteer is now called the teacher, and the teacher is taken into another room and is told to give the learner, the co-subject, a list of word pairs. Girl green, boy ball, whatever. When the learner got a word pair wrong, the teacher is supposed to shock the learner, starting with 15 volts, moving up to 450 volts. The switches the volunteer has in front of him and are used to administer the shocks are marked from slight shock to severe shock to very severe shock to XXX. The volunteer teacher believes that he is administering shocks to the learner when the learner makes a mistake, supposed mistake, although it's really not taking place. The learner's in another room making sounds as though he's in great agony as time goes on, but the teacher's in another room and just hears the sounds. When the volunteer teachers express concern to the experimenter, which they often do, saying, wait a minute, this guy's in trouble here, I'm not going to keep doing this, what do you think I am? The experimenter says, I assume full responsibility. That satisfied most of the volunteers. Ultimately, 65% of all of the volunteers delivered the maximum deadly 450 volts. No subject stopped before reaching 300 volts, which is a very severe shock. We undoubtedly learned something from that experiment about people's willingness to obey authority. The findings of the study were a great surprise to a number of psychiatrists and psychologists who thought beforehand that certainly no more than 10% of the participants would obey authority to the extent of causing harm. However, ethical concerns were raised as well concerning the effect of the experiment on the volunteers. These human subjects ended up learning something about themselves that was far different from what they'd been led to expect that they were volunteering to do. As best as I can find, there still has been no follow-up studies on the effects, the long-term effects of those people and what the experiment and their self-perceptions. I mean, imagine yourself if you had gone in to do an experiment and, I don't know what you thought you were doing, but you ended up finding some awful truth about yourself.
When did that take place?
61 to 63. During the Cold War, moving ahead a little bit, concerns about what might happen in the case of a biological attack led our government to experiment on U.S. citizens as well. 1950, the U.S. Navy sprayed a cloud of supposedly harmless bacteria over San Francisco to simulate a biological warfare attack. They were looking to see where the wind would carry it and what would happen. Soon after, public health records showed a dramatic increase in a pneumonia-like illness that resulted in at least one death. 1966, the Army did the same thing on the New York City subway system. The results of that test are still classified. Jumping ahead to today, we no longer have a moratorium against testing pesticides on human subjects, in case you're interested. Human testing of toxic chemicals, according to the reports, began in 1996 when Congress passed what's called the Food Quality and Protection Act that tightens safety standards on pesticides. Some chemical manufacturers complained that the new standards were based on the worst possible effects that the chemicals could have on lab animals. Usually, if you're going to test toxic substances, you go with animals rather than people. The animal tests are called something called the LD50, LD standing for lethal dose. What that means is that the tests check to see how high a single dose has to be to cause death in 50% of the experimental animals. And what the manufacturers making this stuff has said, oh, come on, that's far too bad of an effect. So the company said that the best way to prove that their product was safe was to test them on people. So they started paying volunteers to drink pesticides and other chemicals. The EPA thought that wasn't a great idea and halted those tests in 1998. In late 2001, the Bush administration reversed that decision. Just this February, the National Research Council panel said, quote, human test subjects could be intentionally given doses of pesticides and other toxic substances as long as companies or government agencies conducting tests met high ethical and scientific standards. Here are the high ethical standards. 1, voluntary informed consent by the participants. That includes awareness that the study is not likely to provide direct benefit to them. 3, awareness that participants can withdraw from the study. And 4, equal inducement for all participants. That means you can't pay one person more than another to get them to involve. Well, I looked around. I love researching on the web. I mean, I find stuff I would never find if I were like just looking through one library or one set of indices. So I found a study conducted in 2003 on a review of procedures for protecting human subjects in clinical studies of pesticides. This study, by the way, was partially funded by Crop America, which is a trade organization representing agricultural and chemical companies. Okay, so the research of whether people were being protected by the companies was funded, at least in part, by the trade organization that represents these companies. Okay. And all the Crop America companies that were involved in the study were, quote, offered an opportunity to read the draft manuscript to ensure that no confidential business information beyond the scope of the paper was included. We're really not going to talk about conflict of interest tonight. I just couldn't resist some of this stuff. The study specifically did not undertake an analysis of the ethical issues beyond those associated with the common rule, that is IRB, voluntary consent, risk-benefit. For example, they did not consider whether the volunteer compensation was so high as to be coercive, or whether volunteer consent forms were understandable by the volunteers. The researchers did not address how the risks to subjects and benefits to society were balanced, or how volunteers were identified or selected. So they didn't even look at that stuff. But nevertheless, they did note the following. 9 of the 15 consent forms did not tell subjects that there were no anticipated benefits. 9 of the 15 consent forms didn't even call what they were doing research. Instead, they called them trials or tests of a chemical compound or compounds. 2 studies didn't mention that their test substances were pesticides. Whoops. 13 of the 15 studies did not include any information about what would happen with significant new findings. Now, what's called significant new findings are findings that might come up in the process of research that indicate that the risk to subjects may be worse than thought before, or the benefits to society may not be as great. 14 of the 15 forms discouraged volunteers by withdrawing, by telling them that if they withdraw for anything other than a medical reason, that their pay may be reduced. And 13 of the 15 subjects required participants to agree to arbitration in case they were injured in the process of the study. That one's a direct violation of the common rule. Now, you think that these things are the kinds of things that a human subject would want to know before drinking pesticides. Nevertheless, the researchers, again, funded by the trade organization representing the companies that are using the testing to show that their pesticides are safe, concluded the following. Society may benefit, companies may profit, and volunteers may be financially compensated for their inconvenience, and of course long-term risks and problems that we don't know about. So risk, benefit, justice, and consent are the 4 basic considerations in human subjects research. All federally funded research involving living human people must be reviewed by an independent set of folks called the Institutional Review Board. The board must include, by law, at least 1 member of the community and 1 non-scientist. It just so happens I've served as the non-scientist on IRB for more than 1 school. And so I've had the opportunity to understand how these considerations are used and how they're often inadequate in protecting people. But I'll save that for a while. First, I want to try out some of your intuitions about research and wake you up. You have a sheet of paper called Research Cases for Consideration. What I'll do is I'll read aloud the case and just ask you for your response. Do you see any issues with it? Any questions? Any concerns come to mind for you? Okay, by the way, these are all real, not hypothetical. These are all real. Pharmaceutical company X has a new AIDS drug ready for clinical testing. The company expects that the drug will provide better long-term treatment than what currently exists, and we'll just call that drug A. and that it will have a higher success rate than drug A in helping bring about AIDS-free babies born to HIV-positive women. The company decides to conduct the research in a West African country that has a high incidence of HIV. Pregnant women in their first trimester of pregnancy are recruited for their test. Each woman receives either a placebo, that is no drug at all, or the experimental drug for the duration of the pregnancy. The experiment will end with the birth and the testing of the babies. Reactions? And don't raise your hands or anything, just sort of use your voice. What do you notice?
Third world country.
Third world country? Why is that relevant?
Why not test in the United States?
Excellent. Good observation. Why aren't they testing that here?
You couldn't test with the placebo.
Why, well, you can't test with a placebo? Why not?
IRB would test with the placebo for an HIV trial.
Okay, so all right, what you're saying, and by the way, I'm going to paraphrase just to make sure that I'm hearing a response and make sure everyone can hear it. What you're saying is that in the United States, the IRB won't let you use a placebo in this case.
I don't think an IRB would approve the use of a study comparing a placebo and an HIV drug.
Why?
Likely they would approve the use of drug A compared to.
Oh, okay, so what you're saying is, boy, comparing a placebo with drug B, let's say the one under consideration, is different from comparing A to B. What would be the motivation of a drug company going someplace where they could use a placebo in one case against the new experimental drug? Cheaper, yeah. It's a lot cheaper to give sugar pills than the existing AIDS drug. Good noticing.
Your data would look really nice if you were comparing it to placebo.
All right, good. Your data's going to look stronger for the experimental drug. Good. All right. But anything else that anyone wants to say about case one?
I have something, just the fact of testing on pregnant women, which is very highly looked down upon. And then the last thing was the last sentence where, why would you end the experiment after birth when that drug that you're giving could cause a baby's effects later on?
Okay, good. All right, so good point. I mean, what you're noticing, and you're certainly right, is that pregnant women, that's a vulnerable population. I mean, lots of problems or issues with pregnant women as compared to other folks for testing. Fetuses, another vulnerable group for testing. And the third thing is the experiment will end with the birth and testing of the babies. Well, the experimenters are getting the data they want. So, which is one way to look at it. Okay, let's take a look at case two. Gary is a new graduate student who has accepted a research position in Dr. Smith's lab. The lab is studying the biochemistry of white blood cells in certain disease states. Infected blood samples are required from anonymous donors with informed consent. Those infected samples arrive at the lab with no identification of the donors. However, there is an ongoing need for blood to be used as control in the study. So everyone who works in the lab, undergraduate and graduate students, postdocs, techs, and investigators all donate on a regular basis. Gary refuses to donate. The others in the lab think that Gary is not a team player.
Perhaps Gary has HIV or something along those lines that's revealing.
Good. All right, good point. Maybe Gary has HIV or has a disease state that he doesn't want his colleagues to know about.
There's also some religious circles that very strongly disagree with donating blood or receiving blood or anything like that.
Good. Gary may have some religious convictions that would interfere with him giving blood. So what do you think about this being a requirement in the lab or an expectation in the lab that everyone gives blood?
It's his right to refuse not to participate.
Yeah, it's his right to refuse not to participate, but on the other hand, who controls the purse strings there?
Are you asking me who's controlling?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's almost a rhetorical question. I mean, the point is that he has a right to refuse, but as somebody working in that lab, would you be concerned about repercussions?
You would think that lab would keep everything confidential.
Right, okay, I mean, yeah, the lab might keep everything confidential, but still the lab director would know, other people working, you know, I mean, yeah. So, I mean, so we've got repercussions on sort of either side. If Gary donates and it's because, I mean, if it's against his religious convictions, or if it's because he has a privacy issue, his privacy gets violated in the process. And what might happen if he doesn't donate?
You could have a really difficult time working in the lab.
Yeah, right. I mean, you know, people think he's not a team player. You know, for those of you who have spent much time in labs, they're real close communities, and often students who are working in labs are dependent on the lab and the lab director for grants, for stipends, for fellowships, for their tuna sandwiches. Okay, let's take a look at number 3. Researchers from the social work department are studying the success factors of 30-year-old women who have returned to school to complete their college degrees. Women who sign up for the study agree to complete personality surveys, cooperate in interviews regarding their personal histories, current home life, and study habits, and they agree to be observed twice during the term, at home and at school. In return for their cooperation, the participants each receive $50 toward the purchase of books and supplies at the university bookstore. One woman who signed up for the study belongs to an intentional religious-based community. When the researchers show up at the pre-planned time to observe the participant at home, they're met by elders who protest the observation on the grounds that observing the participant necessarily includes observing the community, and the community wants its privacy. Comments? How would you articulate the issue here? What's going on?
Some people are being observed without consent.
Some people are being observed without consent. But the subject gave her permission and got her $50.
She's the only one who's being observed with consent.
Okay, but she's the only one who gave informed consent. Does a community have a right to give consent for observation? Or is that something that's just the right of one individual person? What do you think? What are your intuitions about this?
You're gonna have a tough time convincing a religious community or some possibly certain religious communities that that's unethical. No, you're saying that the community have the right to say, no, she can't be.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you can't come here and observe her.
Right.
Because if you come here and observe her, then our community is being observed, and we didn't agree to that. And that's what I'm asking, is what are your intuitions about that? Do communities have a right to do that? Or I can ask the question a little differently. Let's say that your spouse or life partner agrees to participate in a study regarding, I don't know, how you deal with conflict in your relationship. Do you feel that you should have a right to agree or not agree for her to participate? Why?
Because you didn't consent.
Yeah, well, they're not interviewing you, they're just interviewing your partner.
Well, it involves you, or you are unintentionally involved.
Okay, you get unintentionally involved in it. So your privacy might be violated. You might feel, wait a minute, they're talking about me. What about communities? What about reservations or Native American communities? Do they have the right to control research on the reservation? Or should they have the right? Yes or no? Why? Why shouldn't it just be up to an individual to say, sure, you can come out and watch?
It involves everyone else.
Involves everyone else. Okay, I'm not going to argue with the intuition. I'm just going to point out that that's a very different way of looking at research. Although at the University of Montana, we may be a little more aware of that than in other parts of the country, because we are surrounded by different communities, by communities that have autonomy and are sovereign in a way that doesn't happen in a lot of the rest of the states.
You know, we have run into this with getting parental consent for children's participation, and the parents may not be together, so one gives consent and then the other comes in after it's started and puts the kibosh on that. And it's just who is able to commit for an extended group of people with the influence.
Right. Okay, and so again, when we're talking about children, we have a situation where we don't have a individual person who we think is able or has the right, if you will, to make those decisions on his or her own. The examples that I gave you, as I said, they're all real, and while more thoughtful practitioners in a traditional model might find a few problems with them, I would say that the cases lose all legitimacy when one considers what's going on from a perspective different from a researcher's point of view. And we'll get there in a minute. I've got one more question for all of you. And this is actually just kind of a rationality test. If somebody asked you to participate in research, what are some reasons that you would say yes? Why would you agree to participate in research? Or for those of you who have participated in research, why did you say yes? Money? Okay. So $50 toward books at the bookstore is a pretty good deal?
Not me.
No, you might hold out for more. Okay. But all right, money, I mean, that's kind of direct benefit. Any other reason that you could see for participating in research?
If it's for a new medication and you require medication that you can't afford it, or you're wanting to try something that you didn't work in the past, you might have to use some.
Good. Okay, direct benefit, I mean, if you're, sure. Okay, so if you're diabetic, if you're hypertensive, and you might be willing to try out a new drug just because it might be a better alternative than what you've got right now. Good. Any other reason that you'd participate in research?
You might just believe in what is being researched.
Okay, you might believe in it. So you might have some intellectual curiosity, or you might think that it's good for the planet. So that's direct benefit to something or others that you care about. Okay, and intellectual curiosity, I think, is a reason. I mean, sometimes, I don't know, this may just be a thing in South Florida. I mean, it seems like there's all sorts of stuff going on down there, we all sort of read, things that, they're looking for, women of a certain age, to participate in certain kinds of study. I go, looks like it might be kind of interesting. I mean, most of them go, you're kidding. I mean, I'm not going to drink pesticides. But anyway, so intellectual curiosity. So those are the kinds of reasons that make rational sense, I would say, for why we should participate in research. So what we're doing is starting off with the notion of what counts as a competent volunteer. The IRB and researchers traditionally don't ask, well, why would this person want to do that? And if the answer is money, or if the answer is, I'm in a really vulnerable position, like I'm, have a deadly illness and I'll try anything. They don't ask those kinds of questions. Instead, what they ask is risk. What risk is the person being subjected to? From my experience serving in IRBs and doing grant-supported work in the field, I would tell you that hands down, physical risk is what's given the most attention. That is, if somebody is put at physical risk, then researchers have to jump through a lot of hoops to be able to get the project passed. Now that's a good start, but people can also be harmed emotionally, financially, and reputationally. What's interesting about risk analysis is that if the IRB determines that the subjects run no or minimal risk, the project is rarely discussed beyond that point. No risk? Go ahead. Which leads me to criteria 2, benefit. Benefit and risk are traditionally perceived in balance. If there's high risk, then what the IRB wants to balance it out is high benefit. If there's low risk, it doesn't, in my experience, that hardly matters. Question of social justice. The question there is who's being sacrificed for whose benefit? The Tuskegee studies, we're talking about poor African American men who had 40 years of testing when they could have been treated for their syphilis easily 20 years before the end of the test. Part of the just awful problem with the Tuskegee experiments is that we were putting a very vulnerable, exploited population at risk for the benefit of the rest of us. But the justice also has to do with what conclusions do you draw? I mean, traditionally, and I'll say traditionally meaning at least through the 70s, almost all psychological testing happened on college-age sophomore males. Now, I don't know how many of you are college-age sophomore males, or how many of you know college-age sophomore, but the idea that my psychological being is based on an analysis of college-age sophomore males is really pretty scary to me. Consent, voluntary. How much money is coercive? You know, it's really interesting. I've been involved in more than one IRB discussion about participants who are being paid to do certain things, and I don't think that there's anything wrong with people being paid to do certain things. I'm not arguing about that. But the idea of what counts as coercion, how much money is coercive, is something that is explored in terms of a strict monetary amount, but yet it seems to me that it depends on the socioeconomic group. What's coercive? To get prisoners the opportunity to volunteer if it's in exchange for other goodies. I mean, isn't almost anything coercive in that sort of setting? Is it coercive to require students to participate in psychological testing if they want to take a basic psychology course? That's pretty much the rule every place I've taught. You know, if you take an intro to psychology class, you need to participate, for 5 hours of credit in experiments. And that certainly gives the graduate students the populations that they need for their work. And it's now college-age females as well as males. And the argument given for doing that is, look, if you're interested in psychology, you need to be part of the testing to understand what's going on. Maybe. But isn't it coercion if that's the requirement for you to learn the subject? Is it coercion if the course is required by general education, or if the course is required by your major? Okay. Those are some of the questions that I have with the traditional model. So let me explain the relational model, actually referring back to the cases that we took a look at. Rather than begin with the idea of separate people, with a relational model, we begin with the notion of relationship. Sometimes, as with the social work students in number 3, the fact that an individual is part of a network or a community has impact on the test situation. So it's important sometimes to consider the effect on community as well. A relational model asks the question, what good will it do for us to know that information? That question replaces the balancing of risk to human subjects against the benefits to society. It starts with the idea that time, that is the time of the volunteers, time of the researchers, the research effort, the grant money, the university resources, these things are all worth something. And if the research isn't that important, if it isn't likely to give us knowledge that we need in some way, then ultimately it's an ethical waste, even if the researcher does get tenure. But even more importantly, what changes when we go to a relational perspective is the relationship of the researcher to the subject. That is, rather than have human subjects, someone to be used by the researcher to reach a particular goal, a relational base starts with the title collaborator. When individuals choose to be collaborators on a project, they do so for the very rational reasons that you provided of why you would volunteer. Collaborators choose to work together toward a goal of mutual interest or personal benefit. When collaborators work together, it's not a them and us kind of situation that currently exists between human subjects and those who research upon them. Let's take a look at the 3 vignettes. We'll start with number 2 because that's the easiest one to deal with. What is considered common practice in a lot of research settings, including laboratories, tramples on the rights of others, particularly students, in the process. I've done a lot of work with research issues and working with graduate students in science about the research issues that they deal with and the ethics of research issues that they deal with. And I am continually amazed at the, I don't want to call it a level of abuse, particularly since we're misusing that word so much now in terms of what's happening in Iraq. The level of exploitation that takes place with students. I mean, basically, students come in to a laboratory, often undergraduates and graduates, knowing that they have, and it's not really hazing, but it's kind of an expectation that they will work in superhuman kinds of ways to get the breaks that they need to get ahead. I do call that academic hazing, actually. But the expectation that Greg and everyone else in the lab will donate blood is coercive. They're dependent on the lab director for grades, research projects, and it also creates a real them versus us kind of mentality. The infected people are them, the anonymous donors. The us is folks like us who obviously have clean blood. A relational model recognizes that it's not okay to use people for our own purposes, even if they are subordinates in the lab. The first problem, that of the African American women and AIDS, illustrates a number of differences between the two perspectives, many of which you picked up on. You notice that the women who were serving as controls were offered a placebo rather than standard treatment. The next problem is that standard treatment for AIDS doesn't conclude with the infected woman's pregnancy. Taking knowledge and then leaving the research subject to fend for themselves is unfortunately standard research practice for dealing with human subjects. So a relational model would change things, would treat others as we would expect to be treated. Placebo studies, like natural history studies, are only ethical if there is no other choice. It's not ethical to find populations of people in Africa who would otherwise not have access to standard treatment and give them placebos instead. I mean, that was the justification. That, well, it's not like that the researchers are working someplace where people would have access to the standard treatment. And so the researchers justified this particular situation by saying, look, we're bringing drugs to half of this population. It's better than it's ever been. If you value the objective knowledge over the humans who make the study possible, it makes economic sense to experiment on these populations and pull out as soon as you know how many of the babies are born AIDS-free. But a relational model yields a different conclusion. If I, as a researcher, create a relationship with a collaborator that otherwise would not exist, I create new responsibilities for myself. In any relationship, I mean, test this out in your own intuition. In any relationship, the needs of the most vulnerable take ethical precedence. A parent and a child. In a researcher-volunteer relationship, even if they are collaborators, the researcher is in a position of power, and the needs of the most vulnerable, ethically speaking, take precedence. If the stronger is not willing to consider the needs of the weaker, not just the needs of the stronger, it leads to paternalism in the best of cases and inappropriate use of power in the worst. And as you pointed out, it's not okay to limit treatment when it's known that long-term treatment is necessary. Researchers do have ethical clinical obligations to those essential humans because the researchers are disrupting, changing, modifying their lives. How much is ethically required after the researchers have uncovered their knowledge is something that should be determined by context. That is, it's not a matter of equality. Different research populations, different collaborators have different needs. Case number 3, from a relational view, notices that communities, particularly religious communities and indigenous communities, do have rights to protect themselves from researchers. And as researchers who have gained access to these kinds of communities have found, the process of getting in is a long one. It usually requires a researcher who is part of the community with good reason. If you don't have somebody who's part of the community engaged in the research question, it's quite likely that the alien researchers are likely to miss important things that are going on. With this kind of model, some research doesn't get done, and research that values objective outcomes over the human beings shouldn't be done. A last point of change comes when we move from a traditional to a relational model, is this idea of consent. I think that changing our language and our thinking as researchers from human subjects to collaborators is fundamental. I mean, just try on the words, and think about how different it feels to think of yourself as a human subject as compared to thinking of yourself as a collaborator. Human subjects are acted upon by researchers because for some bizarre reason that the researchers never seem to take time to find out, the humans have agreed to be subjected to the experiment. On the other hand, humans who collaborate in research do so because they believe they'll directly benefit. They believe that others about whom they care, and this could be the whole population or the world, will directly benefit from the research, or they're intellectually or personally interested in the outcome of the research. When we look at these rational motivations for collaboration, it's clear that all of the humans who engage in the research potentially see themselves in that partnership role. So what's required of that? Because participants see themselves ultimately as collaborators, is something that I call educated rather than informed consent. Educated consent starts with understanding what the participant is looking for, what the collaborator is looking for. The researcher has an obligation to say to the collaborator, you're not going to get that, or to make sure that the collaborator's needs are met throughout the research, not just at the beginning and signing a form. I've participated in studies involving screening and diagnostic testing at a variety of schools and have consistently been troubled by the differences in views of volunteer collaborators and researchers. The researchers know that they're gathering information that will do the volunteer collaborators no good at all. And I've been engaged in these studies generally because the government has required that there be an ethicist involved. So we've got scientists who are dealing with a particular population, people who have family members who have a congenital late onset disease like Huntington's disease, for example. The government is now, which I think is a great idea, is requiring an ethicist to be involved. And in most cases, the ethicist does what I do, which is work with the scientists, work with the researchers in terms of developing things, but also take some time to go chat with folks who are involved in the study. So an example is when family members agree to participate in a genetic study because they have a relative who has been diagnosed with a congenital disease. Now, in those cases, the physical risk to the family member is just non-existent. Participants give family and medical histories and have their blood drawn. Well, okay, there are occasional surprises when you find out that, who you think is your father isn't, but that's a whole different story. But another kind of example are studies that target an area in which researchers are looking for effects of environmental toxicity or trying to find the cause of an unexpectedly high rate of a particular disease. Now, in those cases, the risk and physical discomfort to participants can be significant. Participants allow biopsies of lungs or other organ tissues. They allow bone marrow samples to be taken. And they agree to participate in longitudinal studies that may last decades. Now, in most of these studies, researchers are concerned that their subjects have signed a piece of paper indicating that they know they're not likely to see direct benefit from the study. In rare cases, researchers are concerned about what to do with the negative information they turn up about individuals who participate in their research. They worry if, when, whether subjects should be told that they're likely or certain to come down with a life-threatening or a life-altering disease. These researchers are sure for the most part that they shouldn't be the ones to tell the subjects the bad news. Now, when I talk to the collaborators in these studies, the volunteers, they see the studies very different from how the researchers see them. And that, I think, is a real problem. First, most folks in these kinds of studies see themselves as collaborators, offering valuable information for a study that matters personally to them a great deal. They want to believe that the researchers will find out something that will help them or at least help their kids. And for the most part, they've never been asked ahead of time what information they would want to know about their condition. And most people do want to know whatever they can, whenever they can. And they quickly get frustrated at the level of non-disclosure from the researchers. I mean, it's very interesting to me when I'm, like meeting with a group of researchers, they're going out collecting data, trying to make sense of it and so on. And they don't tell the subjects anything. The collaborators, the volunteers, the people who are being tested on are sitting there saying, when are they going to tell us something? When? And as time goes on, particularly experiments that go on for a year or more, which are many of them, I've heard researchers in such studies called vultures. Welcomed at first by a community in shock at finding out that they've been exposed, that members of the community have been exposed to an environmental hazard, the people in the community end up feeling that the researchers are yet one more group that's preying on them. People in these studies think that they have a right to information coming out of the studies at least as early as peers and colleagues are given information at professional conferences, and at least as often as granting agencies get reports. Now, when you think about how often that happens, I mean, it's pretty quick that, that as the research is going on, presentation is certainly, you can be less certain when you're giving something at a presentation than when you're sending something in for a refereed publication. And it's not at all unusual for researchers who think that they're onto something will take a study in process to a professional conference and present it because they want feedback from their peers. But they don't tell the subjects. They've got to give reports to the funding agency every year to keep getting their money. And so they tell the funding agency what they think they're figuring out, but they don't tell the people in the community involved or the family. And so while this is a novel idea based on the traditional research model, from the collaborative perspective, the relational perspective, I think it's right. And just the final notion of what follows from a relational-based model of research. And that's that we need to look at at research and our relationships with the community in something a lot bigger than just medical research or research that puts people at physical harm. I've been involved for lots of years with departments of philosophy and departments of journalism. And it always amazes me at how few researchers in those departments, and I'll actually add political science and marketing and other business school kinds of research onto it, how rarely those researchers think that their research ought to be reviewed by the IRB. How rarely they think about the vulnerability of the people who engage with them around research projects. I would like to see institutions require IRB review of every research graduate level and professorial research project that involves human beings. And that includes journalism projects. Now, I'm not talking about research, I'm not talking about writing a news story. That's different, that's not research, it's not generalizable knowledge. But when a journalism student is doing, a graduate student in journalism is doing a project on the effect of a certain story on a target audience, that should go under IRB review. And IRB, most importantly in the relational model, needs to be completely revamped to include at least as many community members, or what I would call uninvolved collaborators, as there are uninvolved researchers. IRB should be willing to add to their group by bringing on members or representatives of vulnerable audiences to review proposals that impact those groups. So just as specific research projects ought to be a collaboration, what I'm saying is that community members should be equally involved in determining how the community can best partner with campus in research across the board. Thank you. Yes, any questions?
So it's obvious then that university research, whatever department, does not have the same requirements for review that perhaps pharmaceutical or medical research. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that generally speaking, the question is whether pharmaceutical and medical experiments have a higher standard or more level of concern than other kinds of departments. Is that the question?
It's the universities or
the universities.
Or campus.
Yeah, I mean, it's really kind of bizarre because ultimately, the only thing that the federal government can control is where the federal government puts money. And so in that respect, I mean, basically any research institution that receives any federal money has to have an IRB, an institutional review board. And that goes for pharmaceutical companies that do research as well as for universities that do research. So in that respect, I mean, that's consistent across the board. But what counts as reviewable research within an institution is where it begins to sort of fall apart. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is that if you're going to do a clinical trial of a new drug, it doesn't matter whether you're doing it out of a pharmaceutical company or out of an institution of higher education. You're going to have to go through the same justifications and safeguards. But it's within a university. What counts as research that needs to be reviewed is the question for me. In my experience, there's a lot of marketing research done that never goes through IRB review. There's a lot of research done. I mean, when I have my graduate students in philosophy write case studies where they're actually going out in the community and talking to people who are part of ongoing, interesting ethical dilemmas, that stuff all goes through IRB. Because as far as I'm concerned, those graduate students are putting the participants at risk. Now, it's not physical harm, but if they're talking to a whistleblower, that person may be giving information that ultimately could cost him his job if it ends up in the wrong hands. I mean, that's risk. And I think it's important for graduate students in any department to sort of understand how powerful they are in that regard.
But are you just saying that some people at the university don't take it to the IRB who should? It's not the IRB who's letting them off the hook.
Combination. Where I am right now, the question is whether it's that some people aren't obeying the process or whether the process isn't working, right? Okay. Where I am right now at the University of South Florida, maybe I should be saying this for publication. Oops. I run into colleagues in various departments at various institutions, which is true, as a matter of fact, where just the rules are different. I mean, I have seen universities where all of the neat, interesting, and it seems to me really intrusive research that business schools are doing these days on marketing and how people react psychologically to various things. I've seen schools where all that stuff automatically goes to IRB. In fact, there are business schools who have their own IRB because they do a particular kind of research. But I've also talked to a lot of folks at a lot of business schools where, the idea of going to IRB with their research.
Right, but if the IRB knew that their research wasn't coming to them, would the IRB say, oh, that's fine, it's not coming, or would they?
Yep. No, that's what I'm saying, is there are some schools where the IRB is limited in either membership or scope to biomedical or strict scientific research. And what I'm saying is, boy, there's a lot of stuff going on out there and where we're putting a lot of community folks in harm's way, and nobody's reviewing it on campus, and I think that's unethical.
Do you see that your collaborative model might bias some research, the outcome of some research?
Okay, all right, the question is whether the collaborative model would bias research. My feeling is that the traditional model that gives primacy and priority to the researcher creates a certain kind of bias. But how do you think that the collaborative model might bias? In what way?
If I understood you right, thinking about, say, medical research where there's a collaborative feedback loop where they're saying, telling the subjects that, okay, we're advancing, having a good effect. That may create a euphoria that would increase or have some advantage for a patient over just the drug that was being tested or the treatment that was being tested.
Okay, so what you're saying is that if, let me see if I have you right, that if there is this collaborative feedback model where instead of giving the research subject no or minimal information, which is kind of the current model, that instead we have researchers who are meeting with the collaborators on a regular basis and saying, boy, I just want to tell you that, we're seeing some really nice results with this drug. That what you're wondering is whether that whether that might actually enhance the drug's effect.
Or the placebos.
Or the placebo's effect.
Yeah.
Well, that would be good news. If it enhances the placebo's effect.
Or vice versa.
Vice versa,
saying
yeah.
that it's
Definitely.
a negative effect. There's one tendency to, oh, I'm sick.
Yeah, okay, right. And so by telling people that you're seeing negative effects, it might enhance the negative effects as well. Well, I think that question is more of a difference of degree than kind. I mean, it is finally, and this has been a long time coming, it is finally convention that if researchers are in the middle of a clinical trial and they suddenly realize that this drug that new experimental drug that they're using to deal with breast cancer is having incredible effect, they will stop the control and basically offer the drug to everybody. On the other hand, if they're seeing that a drug that they're trying out is having bad effect, they'll stop that as well. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is that there now currently is in place what we call the significant findings rule, and that's the idea that if there is evidence that is so overwhelming that it's not only justified to stop, it's not justified to continue. So what I hear you asking about questions, in terms of I think it has to do with the significance. And in terms of what would count as enough significance to say, we want to tell you that we're seeing good things or we want to tell you that we're not seeing good things, I think it depends on how long a trial we're talking about. Excuse me. I see the question coming up more often when what happens with kind of natural history studies, that is natural history of a disease study, or what happens with some of the really interesting new genetic studies that are going on, is that researchers will think that they're seeing something, but it's not really diagnostic. It's certainly not something that they know how to cure. And so it's sort of like, do we want to tell this guy that he might be dead in 20 years? Or that, it looks like that, but we're not sure. It's that kind of level of uncertainty that the researchers are saying, no, we just don't tell the subject. And the collaborators in this kind of thing are saying, we want anything, even if it is speculative. Speculative is better than nothing at all. And if it's good enough to tell your colleagues, it's good enough to tell us, which seems to me to be a reasonable test.
What's the IRB equivalent for private companies? The company not connected with universities doesn't get government funding. Can they do just about anything until perhaps the media find out about it? Is that the media, the IRB?
That's a really good question. I'm used to thinking about, the question is, what about private companies that don't get federal funding? And actually what I'm thinking about are private universities that don't take any federal funding, of which there are very few. Generally, they're not doing a lot of research. And mostly it's just that they want to keep certain religious values or cultural things in such a way that the government can't have requirements for them. I'm used to thinking of the big pharmaceutical companies that are dependent on federal involvement in terms of approving drugs. And because of that kind of federal protection, there is the requirement. But I don't know. I think, I'm not sure. Basically, if you started a research project on your own that you conducted in the basement, is the question, can I do anything I want to people then? Well, there are assault and battery laws, but just what the legal requirements are in terms of informing people of what you're doing, I'm not aware of what the laws in that case. I can tell you what the ethics are.
Lucky I don't have a basement.
It's a good thing you don't have a basement. Actually, that's an interesting question. One of my colleagues, a guy named Bernie Gert, who writes a lot about philosophy and science and the connections between ethics and science, he makes the claim, and I'm not sure I buy this, but he makes the claim that that cheating in science, like, if you fabricate data and all of that, that really only matters if your science is a public activity. And that's the reason that it matters. That's the reason that it counts as cheating. But that if you're just doing science to amuse yourself in your garage, like playing solitaire, it doesn't matter if you cheat. I don't know. I'll have to think about that one. Anyone else? Yes?
I'm wondering, I'm sitting here thinking about this number one case, and I'm thinking about money, and whether funding agencies have taken this idea of yours and have a new line item about ongoing relationship. And I think that it seemed like there was a general feeling in the room that it was wrong to stop this when the baby was born, even though that's really what they were testing.
Mm-hmm.
It was wrong not to follow up. Well, who's going to fund that follow-up? And if you've got a 40-year research career with hundreds and hundreds of relationships, who's going to follow all those people?
Mm-hmm. Well,
It might be wrong, but
right. Well, but you're right. But there are economic interests, and I guess I've got two questions, two responses. One is ethical, and the other one's pragmatic. In terms of ethics, it's really easy to look at what makes economic sense and notice that it doesn't make ethical sense. It's usually a lot easier to do that within ourselves and the community that we understand than looking at, African women. But, for example, a number of studies have been done to show that, everyone knows that medical costs are just, way, out the window. They're just so high that employers can barely afford, to provide medical insurance in some cases. And if you take a look statistically at the economic picture, you will cost society or your insurance company or whomever most in the last 10 days of your life. And so in that respect, the fact that we are pretty sure that somebody is dying is a pretty good reason to stop treating them. Okay? That makes economic sense. A second thing is that most money for medical care is spent on people over the age of 70. And so what makes economic sense is that after age 70, we just kind of provide palliative care. And then we can keep people comfortable after age 70, but we shouldn't do other things. If we did it that way, economically speaking, we'd have a lot more money for health care in this country, a lot more money for prenatal care. It makes perfect economic sense. What's the ethical problem? Uh-oh. I don't want to get any older.
It's your ethical problem. That sounds like. Kids are going to grow up without grandparents.
Kids are going to grow up without grandparents. There's worth for people over the age of 70. Some people aren't going to get medical care that we think everyone should have, even if in this country they don't get it. So that's my sort of ethical explanation, that the fact that something makes economic sense, is something we want to think about, but it's not deliberative when we ask the ethical question. The pragmatic part of it is pharmaceutical companies have a higher profit margin than I think any other industry in the United States right now. One of the responses is that, well, if you're going to justify testing the drug in a third world country, then yeah, you've got a responsibility, even if it is for life, even if it is for the life of those babies, to keep supplying the drug that you've started, because you know that you're talking about something that's a long-term treatment, and you're making so much money off your AIDS drugs and off your Viagra and off all the other drugs involved, that you take some of the share of your profit and you put it into the community that you are using to be able to make a drug to make a lot of money. And so I think that there's a certain pragmatic response as well. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. Yes?
Do you have a website or somewhere with?
Do I? I show up on a lot of websites, so I'm not sure if that's a good thing. I actually, if you've got the handout, you've got my email address at the bottom on both pages, I think. Okay? Thank you for coming.